Hey there, everyone. In this episode, my guest and I will be discussing mental health topics like suicide and depression. Please be advised. Welcome to the Mercy Cast, where we are learning the art of compassion through the adversity of life. I'm your host, Raleigh Sadler. We talk about mental health quite a bit. Now, we might not name it mental health, but this podcast is always talking about different mental health concerns and ways that we can care for ourselves and care for others. That's really the point of it. But I started this podcast because I noticed that many people were saying, my church and my community, we're not talking about these things. How do we do that in our church? How do we talk about vulnerability? How can we kind of push past the Sunday conversation where it's more surface level? Now, some of you listening, your church has pushed past this, but for many of us, vulnerability is not something we see on Sunday, except the vulnerability that we hear about when we hear the gospel. We think of Jesus' vulnerability, but often for us, talking about vulnerability or our mental health journey, it may not be frowned upon, but it definitely doesn't seem encouraged. Today, I want to talk about how we can talk about mental health. My guest today, Chris Morris, is a certified mental health coach dedicated to promoting understanding of mental health issues within the church. His newest book is Resilient and Redeemed: Lessons about Suicidality and Depression from the Psych Ward. Chris, welcome to the Mercy Cast.
Oh, I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me, man.
So why write a book like this for the church, for Christians?
Well, thanks for asking the question, why did I write this book? I'll give you the short answer and the long answer. The short answer is that I have struggled my entire adult life with those things, suicidality and depression. And what I've learned is that sometimes the church is really helpful and really life-affirming and life-giving when it comes to these struggles. And sometimes, probably most of the time, the church kind of stinks at this.
Yeah.
I wanted to write this book then to be able to show through my story that God doesn't dislike people. He doesn't disqualify people. He doesn't disregard people because of a mental health diagnosis. I think that's such an important question to sort of get out there right in the beginning.
Well, and I love that because in your book, you say that 54% of Christians struggle with mental health. And honestly, in theory, Christians should be the best at talking about mental health. But I feel like practice proves otherwise. And so you're saying in this book that even though you may have felt excluded in the church, God cares for you. You matter. And he's including you in his plan. Is that sort of what you're saying here?
That's exactly what I'm saying. I think there's a couple myths that church leaders unintentionally fall into that prevents them from reflecting that same message. Probably the biggest myth that sort of is the granddaddy of them all, it is that mental health is only a spiritual problem. So if I can just get my spiritual life in order, then my mental health is going to follow suit. The problem with that, well, is that it's a myth. It's not true. Let me describe why, though.
Yeah.
Mental health is part of we're holistic beings.
Right.
So our appetite influences our mental health, and our physical health influences our emotional health. So telling someone who is struggling with depression something like this, well, you should try praying more or get in community, and then your problem will go away, is sort of like telling a diabetic, you don't need insulin, just read the Bible. Because a lot of times there's a physical component. Most of the time, there's a physical component to depression and anxiety and other mental health conditions.
Yeah, it's like any other part of our body can have an issue and we can go to a doctor for it. But if there's something with our brain that needs to be looked at, we can really quickly say, well, it's just spiritual. And I love what you said about us being holistic, because I think that is something that's missed. Yes, there are spiritual causes, but there's also physical, psychological, emotional things that can be processed and worked out.
Yeah, the way that I like to coach people is sort of tell them to approach it like you're going to throw everything up against the wall. You're going to take some cognitive reframing, and you're going to, yes, take some spiritual activities, and yes, find some trusted friends, and maybe you need some medication, and maybe you need some counseling. And there's probably 6 or 7 other things I'm not thinking about. Take all of that and throw it up against the wall of your life and see what works. Because the goal is for us to live wholehearted lives. And the way we get there is different for each person.
And you mentioned this, how we all have different pathways to understanding this. What was yours? How was mental health addressed by the church when you were a young man?
Well, let me give a couple stories. One really negative and one really positive, because I want to give equal airtime, so to speak, to both sides. I never want to come off as the guy who's bashing the church, because I'm not that guy.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. So let's start with the negative. A couple of years after I got married, so I was in my early 20s, my suicidality and depression started ramping up in a really dramatic way. I was currently leading in the church, so in a variety of different ways, doing a lot of outreach activities and small group activities. So what it looked like is I would put on my Christian mask to lead these activities. And then when I was at home, or when I was at work, or when I was driving, all of this negativity would just overwhelm me. So my home life, I wasn't the best husband and the best dad at that point in time, because I was struggling. So my wife and I had, we'll call them aggressive conversations. We had some aggressive conversations where she would, and it usually would end with her saying something like, "Chris, you're not healthy and you need to get help." And I would tell her, I got this. I'm going to man up. I don't need any help. Sort of the classic pull yourself up by the bootstraps approach. At some point, I listened to her and I scheduled an appointment with our pastor at the church we were attending at the time, because I realized that I did need help and things weren't going well. So I laid out for him sort of what I just laid out for you. And he responded with 5 words I'll never forget: man up and pray more. He went on to lecture/preach at me that the only reason I was struggling with my mental health is because I wasn't doing the good work, the hard work, the disciplined work of committing myself to Christ. And if I would just do that, everything would be resolved.
Yeah. So he focused on behavioral modification and said, if you do this, you're going to be okay, which sounds kind of like the law. Doesn't necessarily sound too gracious.
And the thing that's crazy is I was doing all those things because I was saved and trained in an environment that was very legalistic. So that was my go-to for everything. Oh, I just need to do more, work harder, be better. And it wasn't working. So I'll be honest with you. I walked out of there going, if all of my spiritual activity isn't producing the results that, should be produced, is there something wrong with my spirituality at its core? So I walked out of there not even sure, like, dang, am I one of those people that doesn't even know Christ as Savior?
Yeah.
And I've been leading in the church, and it really threw me for a loop. Probably 3-4 years, I went down deeper into depression and suicidality rather than up, which is what you would hope you would have after some pastoral counsel. I wavered back and forth for a few years around this, and I hit a low, my low point, my lowest points, probably I guess it would be about 15 years later. 2020 was difficult for everyone, but it was insanely difficult for me for a million reasons. I actually had a suicide attempt. I woke up angry that I couldn't even kill myself, right? We should have put a trigger warning on this. I apologize. I woke up angry that I couldn't even do that right. And I stayed in that place of intense agitation. God did a few things to restore me, but I really want to emphasize one of the things in the context of how the church can properly, healthily, and positively influence those who are battling their mental health. My pastor at the church I now attend came and visited me. I heard that he was in the visitor room, and I'll be honest, because of my experience with my previous pastor and several other run-ins that I've had with Christian leaders, I almost didn't go. I almost was like, yeah, I'm busy. You know it's bad, by the way, when you're in the psych ward and you say you're too busy to visit someone. That's a bad thing. But I went anyway, and we small talked for a little bit. That's also awkward. How are you doing? How do you think I'm doing? I'm in the psych ward. I didn't respond that way, but I wanted to. Are you making new friends? What do you mean, am I making new friends? I'm in the psych. Come on, man. Again, I didn't respond that way. I'm sort of making light of the small talk, just how awkward it was.
Yeah.
And then I saw Pastor Marty's demeanor change, and I thought to myself, here comes the boom. He's gonna rip me up right now. And I sort of steeled myself to get attacked. But the attack never came. Instead, I heard some of the most powerful, meaningful, life-affirming sentences I've ever heard anyone say to me. Marty looked me straight in the eyes and he said, Chris, we can't have this happen again. Don't hear me wrong. I'm not judging you. We can't have this happen again because our church is not the full church that God intends it to be when you're not a part of it. There are things you have to give that no one else can give. And by the way, God's not done writing your story.
Wow.
I'll never forget that conversation.
Wow.
I'll never forget it.
And what do you think was so powerful when he was talking to you after the small talk, of course?
Indirectly, he spoke to the idea that I was believing that there was no place for me in the church because I was busted and broken in a specific way. And not only did he say that's not true, he said, as a matter of fact, not only is there a place for you, there's a purpose for you. And then by telling me that God wasn't done writing my story, he reminded me, hey, this isn't the epilogue of your life. This is like chapter 7. We're right in the thick of it. So hang tight. Something good. Thankfully, he didn't say anything like this because I would not have been able to receive it. But the message was something good is coming down the pike. God hasn't abandoned you, because I felt pretty abandoned by God and by everyone else in that moment.
What's fascinating is the first pastor, he basically said, man up, pray more. And you're probably looking at this person, you're saying, well, I'm doing it, but maybe I'm not doing it enough. And this guy seems to have gotten it. And we start comparing ourselves. I think one of the issues is pastors who have really done the work on themselves to understand their own vulnerability. I feel like anybody, not just pastors, but any leader, any person, when we understand our own vulnerability, we're able to connect with other people who are experiencing theirs. And it sounds like your second pastor is someone who has also processed some of his own journey. He knows that pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps probably isn't the solution.
No, you're right. He's actually the most open spiritual leader I've ever met when it comes to mental health dynamics. He stood up on the stage and said, I'm taking anti-anxiety meds and I'm a better pastor because of it. He has offered examples of people who struggle with their mental health in his sermon illustrations without shame or without judgment. And he creates an open space for people to be real and to be vulnerable.
And I've had leaders come to me and say, you know what, this has been such a tough season that I've got on meds and my head's clearer. a little easier right now. I'm very thankful for them. And so I'm going to continue to take them. And just to see people not pushing that away. Because I remember early on in my own pastoral journey, the thought of counseling for me was reprehensible because I was supposed to be the one who counseled people, not the person who received counseling. But then when you
Sure.
dig into it and you realize even counselors receive counseling, we as humans need to talk to people. We need to be seen and understood. We need to be cared for even when life feels upside down. And it sounds like your pastor did that for you. And I mean, that's something to celebrate. Like, that's beautiful.
Yeah. Like I said, it is a turning point in my life overall, not just like, oh, during the time I was in the psych ward, this thing happened, but it no longer carries importance. It is a turning point in my life because God solidified foundationally some things about how he views me through that conversation.
Well, I wonder if when people say pray more and do more, read the Bible more, whatever, fill in the blank, they're hinting at this idea that maybe you are not spiritually mature. And so if you do these things, you'll become spiritually mature. But what I'm finding is that there may be a difference between spiritual maturity and mental health. Could you tell me, like, is there a difference? Are they the same?
Oh, that's a really insightful question. I've actually given a bit of thought to this. The way that I view it is like this. Some of the greatest heroes that we see in scripture had at least mental health moments, and these seasons where they were overcome, overwhelmed, and just couldn't deal. Moses had a moment in Numbers 11, I think it is, where he said, God, if this is how you're going to treat me, just kill me. That's a pretty dramatic statement, especially when you're not like talking to your baby brother, you're talking to the creator of the universe, who could in an instant go, okay, fine, you're gone. You're dust. Congratulations, you win. And we read I can never remember it's 1st or 2nd Corinthians, but in chapter 1, I think it's 2nd Corinthians, Paul has this moment where he says, I feel overwhelmed by my circumstances to the degree that I'm not sure if I can go on. So let's pull that phrasing out of the Bible for a second and imagine you got a text from one of your friends. I'm overcome by my circumstances and I don't know if I could go on. That's like an immediate phone call. That's a huge red flag.
Right.
Oh my gosh, Bob's in trouble. Maybe I need to get some pizza and head over to his house, just make sure he makes it through the night. And the Apostle Paul is saying that. Now he goes on to say that he recognizes that he's as one who is dead, but he places his trust in the God who raises things from the dead. So there's a beautiful play on words there around dead, the idea of being dead. He goes, I recognize I'm a mess, but God specializes in messes.
Mm-hmm.
So just looking, those are just two examples. We have Moses from the Old Testament and Paul from the New Testament. So, and they both at least had a mental health moment. So we're left with two possibilities as far as I can see it. Either Moses and Paul were not spiritually mature, or perhaps we're trying to say something the Bible doesn't say. So I think that spiritual health or spiritual maturity and mental health they can be related, but it's not there. There's a Venn diagram where there's some overlap, but it's not a single circle.
Well, we're seeing a lot of this with the emotional health movement in books written by people like Pete Scazzero, where they're saying, yes, you may be spiritually healthy, but are you emotionally healthy? Because a lot of people don't know how to manage their emotions. I mean, we go back to our earliest examples, and sometimes those weren't the best. But then you also have, are you mentally healthy? And I think this is helping us think through how to be healthy in a holistic way. And I really appreciated you quoting the scripture there and talking about how Paul despaired of even life itself. Like, this is Paul, who half of the New Testament is from his hand, and he was at that low point. You also see that with Elijah, where he couldn't even get up. God had to send the ravens to him. Mental health is strewn throughout the scriptures, and I think the irony is that we almost have to purposefully look past it. But then when we get eyes to see it, we start seeing these scriptures everywhere. But the problem with seeing scriptures is we can also have bad theological takes. So could you give us a couple of good theological takes on mental health and some bad theological takes that you've come across?
Sure. So I did mention one already, sort of the granddaddy.
Yeah.
I would say that another bad theological take on mental health is that this is related. We can solve it with effort. We can solve our mental health by doing more, by trying harder, doing the same thing, but doing it better. And sort of a better take on that is we need to stay in a position of humility and be open to learning, be open to the idea that maybe I don't have all the tools and all the skills that I need to be able to adequately manage what life is throwing at me right now. Let me give you a specific example. I like to say that I specialize in catastrophizing. That's a fancy word for making a mountain out of a molehill. So I will have a piece of potentially slightly negative news come my way. And in the space of about 30 seconds, suddenly it's become an apocalyptic end times event. And everyone hates me and I'm just going to die of misery in the next day. And so some of that for me was based in my trauma. Some of that for me is based in not having learned the skill of cognitive reframing. And some of it has just been, I've had some tough seasons in my life where the worst thing that could happen kind of did happen. So those three things combined together were the things that I needed to address. So it wasn't, let me just do the same thing and do it better. It was doing the same thing that was getting me in trouble in the first place. So I needed to learn to cognitively reframe. And I do that by asking, Philippians 4:8 is a good place for us to think about cognitive reframing. I can never get the entire verse. Whatever is true, whatever is good, whatever is noble, if anything is praiseworthy, something like that. Think on such things. And the way that I start with cognitive reframing is I use this phrase a lot. I interrogate my thoughts. And I interrogate my thoughts by starting with this question. Is this thing that I'm afraid of necessarily true? Is it a guarantee that this thing is a fact? 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100, I'm worried about a potentiality. So then I ask the question, what other things could also be true? And that helps me to sort of frame, well, there could be 7 different things that could happen, and 2 of them are bad, but 5 of them are really good. And then I ask the question, what can I do right now that will allow me to prepare for whatever outcome comes? And then I've given myself something to do, because part of the problem with catastrophizing is that it puts you in this anxious place where you're afraid to move. So you just sort of sit there as a little stress ball and do nothing. So that third question actually gives me something to do that's practical, that allows me to feel like there's something I can control in my life, which is super important in the midst of catastrophizing.
Cognitive reframing sounds a lot like this idea of taking our thoughts captive that we see in Scripture. And so when you say, is this true? You're taking that thought and you're putting it against the truth. You're saying, is this a fact or is this a feeling? Feelings don't know fact from fiction. And so what other things are true? And then what can I do now? I love that. I think those three questions, is this true? What other things are true? And what can I do now? Can help us all when we get in our heads or when we're overwhelmed or when life just keeps hitting us wave by wave by wave. Because I've found that for a lot of our listeners, that's how it can be. I've had people reach out and they're like, you know what? This last year has been nothing but hard. And then other people are like, it's not been that bad. But there are seasons that we go through where it's really easy just to lose sight of what matters. And I think these three questions, this idea of cognitive reframing, can help us. How do you remember to continue to use this tool when you're going through it?
Yeah, it's been a process for me to learn how to do that. This is where community comes into play for me. One of the changes I needed to make in my life after my suicide attempt was I needed to have people that, number one, I'm entirely honest with about where I am in my mental health. And number two, people who can call me out if they see me doing things that seem less than healthy. And I'm blessed that I have about 5 people, my wife, one of them, who I can have those conversations with. So 2020, 2021, this process was very manual. And it usually looked like I'm talking to my wife or one of my close friends, kind of complaining. And they say, Chris, you might be catastrophizing. And I go, oh, crap, I'm doing that again. So I didn't even recognize it. Now I'm at the point where, because anxiety is something that exists in our body, I'm much more aware of what's happening in my body. When I feel anxiety, my chest starts to tighten. I start to sweat for no reason. I have racing thoughts. So I'm recognizing the characteristics of anxiety. And then I ask myself, am I feeling anxious about something? What am I feeling anxious about? And then I go into those 3 questions. Is this necessarily true, this thing that I'm anxious about? So it really comes back to something that a lot of my counselors have talked to me about, being aware of what's happening in your body. And that is hard work. It is really hard. It's a very manual process. But just like with any skill, over time, you get better at it, then it becomes more comfortable and more familiar to you.
Counselors will say, when you're telling them your story, they'll ask, okay, so as you describe this, where are you feeling it? What's going on in your body? Is your chest tightening up? Are you feeling it in your neck? Do you feel flush in your face? Is your stomach turning? What's going on? And I love that because they're training you to recognize. So when it does happen, you can say, okay, so anxiety's happening. All right, I'm going to take a step back. And having people who can help you, especially in those early stages, like you're saying, having that community. Wow. I think for a lot of us, we just try to do this Lone Ranger isolated approach where we are the man or woman of God. We're going to go out there. We're going to do the work. Whether we are ministers or missionaries or what have you, we're going to go out there and then we hit a wall because the world is not always kind. And we're not always kind to ourselves. And life just beats us up. But you talk about this community, you're not necessarily saying you just jump into a small group, though that's important. You have 5 people that you've selected that are safe people that you trust around you. I've noticed just recently, a lot of people who are doing ministry, they don't go on about it. And I kind of wish they did, but they all have teams around them. Like 4 or 5 people that they can go to with anything, that they can be as real as humanly possible with. And I found that in my own life, having that team around you, I mean, the help is immeasurable. But yeah, like I loved what you said about how to recognize what's happening in our body as well as having that community around us. That is just, that's good. How would you encourage us to find people in the church that we can talk to about our mental health issues?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that part of it, we we have to sort of slowly ramp up. It can't be like meet someone at church. Hi, I'm Chris. I'm feeling suicidal today. How you doing? Like that doesn't help anyone. But there's like baby steps we can take where we can initially get a vibe for someone where we feel like, hey, I'm connecting with this person and I feel like we might have some similar things in common. So this might be someone that I could connect with on a deeper level. And then what I encourage people to do, because I recognize that I'm very blessed to have 4 or 5 people in my life. And I know that a lot of folks, especially those struggling with mental health, they don't even have one. So they go, well, you having a team of 5 just doesn't, that's not my life. So I don't know what to do. So what do I do? And I encourage them as they think through the people that they feel like they have a connection with, take a small risk. I can't remember where I read this, but there was a book I read that talked about the idea of giving people the gift of going second. And this is in the context of vulnerability. So the idea is take a small risk in a regular conversation to be a little vulnerable and see what happens. That could look as simple as you see someone, they go, how are you doing? Rather than saying, I'm doing great, praise Jesus, or some classic Christian answer, say, it's been kind of rough, but I'm hanging in there. And then watch carefully how the person responds. I found one of my closest friends in this exact way. I said, it's been a little bit rough lately, but I'm hanging in there. And he was in the middle of doing something. He's like, let's sit down and tell me what's going on because I care about you. I was blown away.
Wow.
And this happens more often than you would realize and than you would expect. So we take that risk of going first, giving someone the gift of going second in a small way. Like I said, not dumping our garbage because our friends are not our counselors.
That's right.
But just saying it's been rough and see how the person responds, and you might be surprised.
Right. We're not working our stuff out on our friends, but I do think I love what you said about that. Like, yeah, it's been tough. You're being authentic, you're being real, and you're not also putting everything on that person. You're building it up, as you said, baby steps. Yeah, I think that's a needed word for us because I think so many people in the church right now, they go to all the programmatic activities, but they feel isolated. And they don't feel like they can have anyone to talk to. But it's those 2 or 3 people that you connect with and you're authentic with, while you might not be totally vulnerable in that moment, you're vulnerable enough to say, this is hard.
Yeah.
And people who've been through it, they want to talk about that. I'm always surprised when I meet those friends too. People who don't run from your pain, but they kind of run to you and say, all right, let's walk through this. I got my own stuff too. Let's be friends. I think that's so important.
Yeah, there's this lie, like all of us have been told this. I don't know where it comes from. And what the lie is if you share that you're struggling, you're going to be seen as too much.
Mm-hmm.
And none of us want to be too much. So instead, we hide in the shadows and we struggle in silence. And it's so damaging.
Because then we become too much. Because now we're damaging ourselves and we're not caring for ourselves. We're not bringing people into our lives. One of my past guests, Neil Salzman, said that the best way to do self-care is to realize that you can't do it alone. You need people in your lives to do self-care. And I think that is just an important reminder that we cannot isolate ourselves. We also shouldn't just be vulnerable to everyone, because if someone's not bought in, that could be damaging too. So it's that idea of discernment, right? Like finding the people that truly care for you. And you found your friend just with that one statement. Yeah, it's a little rough. How would you encourage us to start talking about mental health in our churches?
It's a good question. I think that some of that, obviously it sort of starts at the top. I've seen some churches do like a mental health awareness Sunday. where they just interview people one or two people in the church who are in the middle of struggling.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a really valuable tool because so many times in churches, we want to highlight the victory stories. And that's great to do. But unfortunately, most of us aren't living in a victory story every moment.
Yeah.
So when all we see is victory stories, we feel like that's all we have permission to share. So interviewing people who are in the middle of something is really important and really meaningful. So that's one thing you can do. There are a number of curriculum out there that are helpful in like a small group setting. Living Grace is a great tool. It's a 16-week class that is literally, the way I describe it to the people when we run it at our church is, I want to give you a toolbox for your mental health. Every week is another tool. This one's a screwdriver. This one's a hammer. Here's some pliers. It's a great tool. And then there's another one called Fresh Hope that is more of an ongoing small group curriculum. I would compare it somewhat in the way that it approaches things to like a 12-step program. Not exact. There's a lot of differences, but that's sort of the vibe that it gives. It's more ongoing supports and encouragement. And then there are trainings that you can do. There's something called a Hope Coach that literally is training people to be excellent listeners for those who are in mental health crises. There are churches that have 200, 300 people that are Hope Coaches.
Wow.
Those are probably some of the healthiest church communities out there. So those are some starting points.
Oh, thank you so much, because I know some of our listeners may be at that point where they don't feel heard in church. They don't feel seen. But just in this conversation, I feel like you've given us so much hope because you've talked about the negative experiences, but you've also talked about the positive. And you've kind of given us a little bit of a blueprint for moving forward and some things that we can do right now to engage this issue and not push it under the rug, but actually realize that, 54% of Christians are struggling with their mental health. This is something that needs to be addressed. This is something that needs to be talked about. The church should be a safe place for this discussion. And so thank you for all that you do to push this discussion along.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's sort of like I told you in the beginning, it's born out of me needing it myself. It's like that statement, be the friend you wish that you had. I always hated when people would say that to me, and now I'm doing the same thing. I don't know what that says about me.
No, that's the whole point of this podcast. Because when we end an episode, I always say, have mercy on yourself and each other. And this idea of being the friend that we wished we had, you're ultimately saying, yes, this is what I need. And so I'm not that different from everyone else. Maybe someone else needs this.
Yeah.